A local activist group called Outpost protested at Connecticut Riverwalk Park yesterday in Springfield. They are very upset about Trump's homelessness displacement policies. Western Mass News spoke with one protester to hear more about why they wanted their voices heard.
Out here, I'm here supporting a Springfield group called Outpost. It's a group of young people who are getting involved in the political scene right now, specifically as a response to displacement of homeless or unhoused peoples, which is a focus in Washington, D.C., but is also something that's happening in Western Massachusetts.
Multiple people took to the streets with signs in hand to express their discontent. Protesters say they felt compelled to do this for their community and people of all walks of life.
Well, first, I think that people who may feel that they're alone and facing down an overwhelming amount of disinformation, misinformation, they feel alone. I want them to first know that they're not.